All right, starting notes for chapter 3, section 1, dealing with the cell theory and a little bit of history on the cell theory and then basic information about types of cells. So clearly we need to know and understand that cells are the basic fundamental unit of all living things. It is a basic principle, basic characteristic of living things that if you are considered to be alive, you have to be made of cells. So that is a key component to our cell theory, which is a body of work, really. I know when we say theory, we think we can sum it up in one nice little phrase, but the cell theory is a body of work that a lot of scientists contributed to, especially as over time microscopes became better tools for inquiry and study, and so they could see more and know more. So we have various scientists, Hooke, who told us that cells exist, basically, Robert Hooke, and named cells after monks' rooms in the monastery, because that's what they were called, cells, and they're kind of plain and small. Leeuwenhoek, who worked with one of the first microscopes. Schleiden and Schwann were scientists who studied animals and plants separately, but they both came to the same conclusion that animals and plants are made out of cells. And then Virchow, who told us that all cells have to come from pre-existing cells, which kind of debunked the whole spontaneous generation theory, which said that living things can arise from non-living things, which was a theory, back in the 1700s. So Virchow said, nope, cells come from pre-existing cells. And so again, all this came about as we had improvements in our microscopes. We could see microscopic life, things that we couldn't see before. We could study pond water, and we know pond water is teeming with microscopic life. And so once that became available, people studied everything and looked at everything they could under the microscopes. So the cell theory is a unifying concept of biology. It is one that encompasses a lot of various ideas, but has held true for hundreds and hundreds of years. So what kind of things are found in our cell theory? There are 3 basic principles of our cell theory that came about due to all those early studies by those 5 and more scientists. Those scientists we mentioned, get the credit, but clearly there were more scientists studying and contributing to things about the cell. So the 3 principles of the cell theory. Number 1, all organisms are made of cells. If you take a sample of an organism, you should find multiple cells. If it's a single-celled organism, it has to be composed of a cell that has certain components to it. Second tenet of the cell theory, our second principle, is that all existing cells that we have today came from other living cells. So at some point along the way, a cell divided to produce new cells. And that the cell is the most basic unit of life. You can be unicellular and still be considered living, being made out of one cell, or you can be multicellular, made out of trillions of cells that are working together in complex harmony, or you can be someplace in between. But those are the 3 principles to the cell theory. Make sure you know those. Organisms are made of cells, all cells come from other living cells, and that cells are the basic unit of life. So when we look at other cells or cell types, there's 2 basic cell types. And you might say, oh, animal and plant. But even more generally speaking, we can classify all cells into one of 2 categories. They are either prokaryotic or they are eukaryotic. So there are certain things that all cells have in common, okay? All cells. So the first thing that all cells have in common is that they are microscopic. Cells, very few cells can you see with the naked eye. Cells are microscopic. All cells are enclosed by some kind of membrane. Even prokaryotic cells, which we'll talk about in a sec, but all cells have to be surrounded by some kind of external boundary, separating their internal environment from their external environment. And all cells have a cytoplasm material inside of them. So they have some space-filling fluid where chemical reactions can take place and structures can be found. So our 2 types then are, like I said, eukaryotic and prokaryotic. What's the difference? Basic difference here. This picture shows you a eukaryotic cell. You can see that it's very complex. There's lots of different things inside that cell. Not expecting you to be an expert on what those things are because they're all stained pretty much the same color, which is how they would look in real life. Actually, they'd be clear in real life, but with a stain, they all kind of show up the same color. We see them in pictures, multicolored, and that's just to help us understand the parts. But the one thing that a eukaryotic cell has that others don't would be a nucleus, right? So that large purple stained structure is the nucleus, which is where we find DNA and chromosomes composed of DNA found. So prokaryotes do not have those types of organelles, okay? So all those organelles that we see inside this eukaryotic cell, prokaryotic cells don't have them. They also don't have a nucleus, okay? So you can see the difference between the two. The eukaryote has the nucleus and the prokaryote, much simpler, not a lot of stuff inside the prokaryote. So no membrane-bound organelles, but the one thing that they do have in prokaryotes, you can see them in the picture down here, all those little green dots, would be ribosomes. So they're not green in the eukaryote, but the eukaryote also has ribosomes. But ribosomes are the only organelle that is not membrane-bound, so they can have those. So eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, have membrane-bound organelles. Prokaryotic cells, no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles, but they do contain ribosomes.